Good morning. We are very glad to have all of you with us in person and online. And by the way, if you're online, if you could just give a little shout out, a little hey, a little heart, a little like, that'll help us know that you're with us. We would really appreciate that. So we begin a new series this morning in the book of Genesis called ReGenesis. We will be in Genesis all fall long until Advent. Our new children's class that started today is also going to be in Genesis. Our teen class will be studying Genesis, and Children's Church will also be looking at Genesis. We will be experts in the book of Genesis by the end of this fall. Now, sometimes when we come to the book of Genesis, we may get the impression that since it's the first book in the Bible, it was the first book written in our Bibles. And that's actually not the case. These are very ancient stories in the book of Genesis, but they weren't the first ones written down. We don't know exactly when Genesis was written down, but it's likely that it was written down in the form that we have at a time when the people of Judah were dragged away into the Babylonian exile. And it was a time of intense disorder. Buildings were toppled, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, lives were lost, people were transplanted to the pagan nation of Babylon. It's hard for us to overestimate the sense of disorder that people must have felt in that time, and it may have been during that time that someone sat down to write out the ancient stories that we have in the book of Genesis. And as such, it seems to have been written at a time that evoked feelings that may be similar to the feelings that we experience as we think about September 11, 2001, because it too was a time of intense disorder. Buildings toppled, lives were lost. There was a sense of the whole world being turned upside down. Genesis was written in a time of intense disorder. And for some families, this back-to-school time can be a time of disorder as we think about sending our kids back into schools that may have various degrees of disorder to them. Or as we think about releasing them back into the world after having them close by our side, safe and visible during the summer. This back-to-school season can trigger fears and anxieties because it feels like our children are stepping back into quite a disordered world. And so the book of Genesis, especially these first few chapters, seems to have been written to portray God as one who brings order into disorder. And these opening lines remind us of that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Now, this word translated form is the Hebrew word tohu. Everybody say tohu. And the word tohu describes something that lacks boundaries, that's incontainable, that's chaotic and unmanageable. The word translated void is the word bohu. Everybody say bohu. And bohu describes a space that doesn't contain stuff that's productive and useful and sensical. And so together these two words, without form and void, tohu and bohu, describe something that feels chaotic and untamable. And the text continues, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The image here is of a deep, churning ocean. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The beginning portrays a moment of intense and frightening disorder. And then God speaks order into that disorder. Where there is tohu, God makes habitable and ordered space. He does this in days 1 through 3, separating the waters above from the waters below and moving the oceans to create oceans and dry land. And where there's bohu, God fills that space with life-giving and productive creatures. He does this on days 4 through 6, filling the space with sea creatures and birds, and the land with animals, and then humans, step by step, day by day, bringing order into disorder. Now, most of us have been familiar with this Genesis creation story for so long that it doesn't quite jar us as it might if we were listening with the ears of a Jewish refugee in Babylon at the time of the exile. Because if we were, we would have known other ancient creation stories that were going around. The Babylonian creation story was called Enuma Elish, and it was quite different. In at least some versions, it described the beginning where there were a freshwater god and a saltwater god, Tiamat and Apsu, and their waters commingled and created other gods and goddesses. And then the other gods and goddesses were so loud and so crazy that it really got on Tiamat's and Apsu's nerves, so much so that Tiamat decided to gather her forces and destroy these other gods and goddesses. And parents are beginning to nod. Yeah, I know that feeling. And then the other gods and goddesses enlist the help of a god named Marduk to protect them against Tiamat. And Marduk wins. And Marduk slays Tiamat, and Marduk slices Tiamat in half, using half of Tiamat's body to create the heavens and half of the body to create the foundations of the earth. And the rest of the gods and goddesses are still quite dissatisfied because there's a lot of work to do in this newly created earth and cosmos. And so Marduk creates us to do all the menial labor so that the gods can enjoy life eternal. In ancient creation stories like this one, you essentially have gods taking disorder and bringing into it even more disorder. Just their own brand of disorder. But in the creation story of Genesis, written as a contrast to these ancient stories, you have God bringing order into disorder. And He doesn't do it through violence or power plays as in these other ancient creation stories. He does it through the calm and creative speech act. He speaks order into existence. Again and again, the author of Genesis tells us, and God said 4 times in days 1 through 3, and God said 4 times in days 4 through 6, and God said. God calmly and confidently brings order into this order. And again, the author of Genesis 1 tells us that this order that God is bringing into the chaos is good. It's the Hebrew word tov. Everybody say tov. Again and again, this Hebrew word shows up in the creation account. It has a range of meanings. The word tov can refer to something that's practically or economically good. It's productive. Something that's good in terms of being desirable or pleasant and beautiful. Something that's good because it's good quality. Something that has a moral goodness to it. And fifth, something that is philosophically good. It makes sense. It's reasonable. And perhaps all of that is in mind in the pen of the author of Genesis 1 as he looks at all that God has created. Because it is indeed practically good. It fulfills its purpose. It's driving out the chaos. It is pleasant and beautiful. It has quality to it. There's a moral goodness to at least some of it. And it's philosophically good. It makes sense. It's reasonable. Again and again and again throughout the creation account, we're told that all that God creates is good. And finally, at the very end, we're told that it was very good. This God who creates order out of disorder creates something that is tov. It is beautiful and pleasant and meaningful and fulfills all the purposes for which it is made. So, a couple of takeaways. First, despite any disorder that we sense in ourselves, that we sense in our world, that we sense even in others, Genesis 1 invites us to believe in the inherent goodness of what God has created and who God has created. When events like September 11th happen, they often destroy our faith in humanity, destroy our faith in the world. What Genesis 1 invites us to do is to trust in the inherent goodness of the world and of the people in the world. There are still beautiful and pleasant things to worship God for. There are still remarkable humans on this planet. And as we send our children back to school, Genesis 1 is an invitation to trust that the world we're sending them back into is still a tov world, a good world, that God will provide some people in our children's lives who are some of the best people on this planet. And God will give our children experiences that are beautiful and pleasant during this school year. And second, despite any disorder we sense in our world or ourselves or even in others, Genesis 1 invites us to believe in a God who has, who is, and will continue to bring order from disorder. Genesis 1 is telling us that the God who speaks order into disorder is still speaking today. And so when those days come during this school year, when we're struggling, when our children are struggling, when our schools are struggling with some disorder, Genesis 1 calls us to trust that God is still in the midst of that, capable of speaking order into even that chaos. And when our own headlines feel all too similar, like September 11, 2001, when we endure disorder difficulties in the here and now, Genesis 1 is telling us to believe that there is still a God who is still speaking and capable of bringing order into that disorder. I'd like to invite you to say the words of this prayer aloud with me. Creator, as you did in those first days of creation, order the disorder that dwells now within our hearts. Order the disorder that walks still within our world. Order the disorder that turns our dreams into nightmares. Open our hearts to trust in the goodness of all you've made. Open our eyes to see the beauty of all you've made. Open our hands to join your ongoing work of order making.